video. Okay.
My setup is not there, but yes, I'll put it on video. Yeah.
Okay. And then do you also it's live and then you'll also produce it into a podcast?
Yes, yes,
Got
yes. Video
it.
will
Okay.
also be there. Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And can we,
Okay.
did I read correctly on yours that we can get a copy of the the video
Exactly.
recording?
Yeah, yeah. Both,
Okay,
both, both
perfect.
you'll get it after that. Yeah.
Perfect. Great.
Perfect. Great. So let's start. Hey everyone, welcome to Healthy Waves, the podcast where we dive into the raw, unfiltered stories and wisdom from the experts to help you create powerful transformations in your life. So today's topic is one that I know will resonate with so many of you. It's about breaking free from chronic pain and the mental illness. So we are tackling it head on and not just with the science and the therapy, but with a holistic twist that challenges what you think you know about healing. That's amazing, right? So our brains often convince us that thinking through the pain or the mental distress is the solution. But here's the truth is, it's not. So today you will hear like why that belief is holding you back and discover the practical steps that you can take to finally break the cycle. So joining me are the two incredible guests, Lindsay Garnick, a licensed clinical social worker, therapist, and storyteller extraordinaire, definitely, who helps people rewrite the narratives that keep them stuck. And uh, also, BT, a man who's seen over 700 people experience supernatural healing through his unique three-step prayer method. So get ready to unpack some myths, shift perspectives, and live with the tools to help you experience the lasting freedom. So welcome to the show.
Well, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Lovely, lovely. So I'll quickly start with about the understanding the like I was mentioning about the brain. So understanding the brain's deception in the mental illness and the pain. So I'll first start with Lindsay. So Lindsay, like you have worked with so many people who feel stuck in the destructive thought loops, right? So so here like in today's discussion, the topic touches on this idea that our brain often deceives us into kind of thinking the solution to pain is found in kind of over analyzing it. So, what do you see in your practice that backs up this idea?
Well, we're such problem-solving beasts, right? In the external world, we go through every minute of every day, pretty much construing everything we come in contact with as a problem or a puzzle to be solved. And of course, thinking is king in terms of our problem-solving strategies. We've gotten very good at it. It serves us very well in the external world under a lot of different conditions, not so much in the internal world. And for most people, it's pretty frustrating when they bump up against the reality that our internal worlds don't respond to our masterful problem solving slash thinking skills in the same way as the external world. Internal experiences just aren't playing by the same set of rules.
Okay, okay. And so like how do our thought patterns sometimes trap us in the problems that we're trying to solve?
Well, if we can understand our problem-solving apparatus, the brain, and thinking, which is the pathway for that apparatus, kind of a wood chipper, right? A wood chipper just keeps running. And if you just leave it run, it doesn't notice or care if you're putting stuff in or not putting stuff in. And anything you feed into a wood chipper will get chipped and come out the other side as chips. And that's sort of how thinking works in the sense that the brain doesn't really differentiate between internal world experiences or external world experiences as
Mhm.
it's chipping away. So, what people frequently experience is that as they try and problem solve these internal world experiences and they're not
Mhm.
successful with it, then they start creating storylines to
Mhm.
explain that lack of success, right? How is
Mhm.
it that this isn't working? And the brain, being this thing that only knows how to make wood chips, so to speak, which
Yeah.
we could say are thoughts, continues to generate more and more and more and more because that's all it knows how to do. And ultimately, all of those thoughts are conglomerated into some sort of narrative about how things are or why things are the way they are. We're meaning making creatures. That's part of
Yeah.
problem solving is sort of being interpretive. And so whether the interpretation that we come up with is inaccurate or accurate or more or less in alignment with what's happening or not, it's what we create and what we get wedded to very, very quickly. And once we're wedded to a certain storyline about the way things are, it becomes very powerful for us in terms of refracting back on that internal experience.
Wow, that's really awesome. I mean, really interesting. I mean, um, you have mentioned before that therapy is about rewriting the stories that we tell ourselves. Um, that's really interesting. But if you can also share, like, what's the first step for someone who feels like they're stuck in a story that's defining their life in a negative way?
Mm, there are a couple of places people can start with storylines that aren't
Yeah.
serving them. And the first one I think is counterintuitive, which is to ask, well, how does this storyline serve me? Because
Mm.
usually there is an element that is doing
Yeah.
something that sustains our investment in that storyline, right? It's a little bit
Mm.
when we talk about self defeating behavior, there's always a nugget in there that feels like it's doing something constructive because if it didn't, we wouldn't do it at all, right? Human behavior always has some sort of reason. It's never irrational. There's always an element of rationality even if the bigger picture maybe is not what we're hoping for. So asking ourselves, like, gosh, what does this storyline do for me that keeps me
Mm.
invested in it is a really good place to start. Does it provide some comfort that even though I don't like the content, the
Mm.
certainty is more comforting than uncertainty? Many people are more comfortable with an upsetting storyline than no storyline at all because we find uncertainty and gray area very, very disconcerting. So it's certainly not uncommon for folks, myself included, to sort of double down on a storyline that doesn't serve us because even though it doesn't serve us, it feels better than no storyline at all. Some sort of meaning, some sort of framework is so much reassuring than sort of feeling like you're floating out there in the abyss, so to speak. So by being curious about how a storyline does serve us, even if that's only in 10% of service and the other 90% is kind of destructive, we can
Yeah.
really start to be curious about why we're so wedded to it. And then get curious about really what the trouble is. If
Mm.
I'm wedded to a narrative that in a way is causing me a lot of problems, being curious about why I'm still wedded to it despite those difficulties is going to be
Mm.
really helpful when it comes to unwinding from it and doing something differently.
Wow. Lovely. That's really lovely. And so I'll come to BT, like, uh, regarding false narratives to healing through the faith.
Yeah.
So BT, like, you have witnessed over 700 people experience healing. So, and also, like, you often say that the root cause of chronic pain and the mental health issues is spiritual. So if you could share an example, like, of how someone found relief by addressing the spiritual root cause of their problem.
Yeah. And I wanted to also echo back with what Lindsay's talking about. These thoughts that we have are so powerful. Our
Mhm.
thoughts actually operate in the spirit realm. We don't understand it because we all
Mhm.
recognize there's probably a higher power somewhere out there that created everything.
Mhm.
And we recognize sometimes that something in this higher power realm, I'll just call it a spirit realm, spiritual realm, that they interact and impact our lives here on earth. And our thoughts actually have a lot to do with that. So, probably a simple way to share an example is one of the ladies that I worked with is at this time she was 73 years old and she'd been in a wheelchair for 11 years. And she is a very vivacious person. She loves people, and she couldn't get out of the wheelchair. And I was asking her what was going on. She said the ball on the bottom of her right foot was so excruciating painful that if she were to step on it, she just would collapse. So she was in a wheelchair. And I took this initially from sort of a spiritual approach, saying, and the way the spiritual approach says is if you think about all the ancient religions, it doesn't matter whether it's Buddhism or Muslim or Christianity or Jewish or any of the archaic religions that are no longer around, they all have a common theme that there's a creator that has to be appeased. You have to bring contrition, basically saying, I'm sorry that I did something that maybe you didn't want me to do. And then you ask your request to be released from it. And there's this pattern. And so I used that same approach with this lady. Her name is Francille. And I said, ask God if there's anything, and I gave her a list of things that to kind of focus on. Anything that you may have done somewhere in the past that could be tied to this pain in your foot. And I asked, have you done this? Have you done that? Different things. She said, no, no, no. And she had a pretty good life. And then she said, oh, I remember. Watch this. It was some secret society she was involved with in high school. So this is now 55 years earlier. And she had made some sort of an oath that was kind of contrary to what you would say, honoring a God of the universe. And so I said, well, why don't you say I'm sorry for that? The word that I guide her in is repent. Basically, it's a spiritual word that says, I'm sorry. So she said, Lord, I'm sorry about taking this oath that was against you. And I then said, God, if that was the key, would you now take this pain away? And literally, I asked her to get out of the wheelchair, and she gets out, and all of the pain was completely gone. She was walking around normal, first time in 11 years. And then I checked back with her, and this is the point I want to make about the thoughts. I checked back with her a week later, and she says, I'm back in the wheelchair. Okay, so she was out of the wheelchair, and then the pain came back, and she got back in. And I approached her on an approach with this, and the approach was her thoughts. And I said, here's what I think is going on. So in the spirit realm, my platform that I formulated, what works, that's been consistently working with other people, is that there are spiritual forces in the spirit realm that impact our bodies, whether it's pain or whether it's anxiety or depression or even relationship conflicts that are just always bickering and fighting at each other. And taking that framework, I've built an understanding that there's something that gives them a right to be able to come in and attack us. And one of those big things is the thoughts that you have. Because the thoughts that we have aren't just physical, they're spiritual. And so I approached back with Francille, and I said, Francille, I think what's going on is you've been in that wheelchair for 11 years, and your thought is you ought to be still back in the wheelchair. I call it an identity problem. Her identity for 11 years is she's been in pain, in the wheelchair, and that's normal for her. And now that she's out of pain, it's like it's not normal. So I said, I want you to break those negative thoughts. I want you to renounce any thought, and these were unconscious, subconscious thoughts, any unconscious or subconscious thought of your identity of being in pain. Because obviously something happened and the God of this universe freed you from that pain. So she did. She said, I renounce my identity of being in pain. And then I told her, now command that pain out of your foot. I call it a spirit of pain, just to give it kind of a nomenclature. So she said, I command you to get out of my foot. And instantly the pain left. And so now she's walking around. This was about October. I checked back with her in December, said, how are you doing? She said, I've been out of the wheelchair the whole time. I said, great. And then I checked back with her in November, in January, about 4 months after all of this. And I said, how are you doing? She said, I'm back in the wheelchair. I said, well, have you renounced your thoughts of identity of pain? And she texted me back 30 minutes later and says, it's gone. And she's back out of the wheelchair again. So your thoughts really play a lot, but that kind of shows you a pattern of how things that we do that maybe somewhere in the spirit realm we should not have done. And this God of the universe is, I don't want to say upset. It actually goes a lot deeper than that. It's more of a, what I'll call a discipline to bring about correction. Just like when we have children that disobey, we correct them to bring about correction. So it more falls in line with that, but by simply saying, I'm sorry for the things that he brings to your mind that may be the root of it, a lot of these things disappear. But if it's something that's been chronic, that's been in your life for many years, a lot of times we'll fall back into those wrong thinking patterns that I ought to still have this issue. And that becomes another opportunity, another right for the torment to return. And simply renouncing that, I've seen it oftentimes get rid of it.
That's amazing. Thank you. Thank you for sharing this. And
It is
I was
amazing.
also, yeah, you're saying something.
No, I was just saying it is amazing. I have
Yeah.
been, can I share just a real personal story of my background? Because this is really cool.
Hmm.
I come from 7 generations of medical doctors. That's over 200 years consecutive, one doctor after another after another. So there's sort of like this mantle of healing in my family line. I never went into medicine, but with medicine, it's always, it takes time for someone to heal and recover. And as I started to apply this approach to saying, if there's a spiritual root, now, by the way, not every issue we deal with has a spiritual root, but if it's a spiritual root, the key to getting free of it is to renounce or apologize for that spiritual root. And then it's like God intervenes and miraculously restores. And almost everything, all those 700 plus people that I've seen, they were all totally restored in whatever their issues were, usually within that one day and frequently within less than an hour. It's really been amazing.
Wow, lovely. That's really so powerful. That's really so powerful, I would say. Yeah. So, the signs of stress and the role of faith. I'll come to Lindsay. So you lead the workshops on practical stress management that can reduce the symptoms in 3 minutes or less. So what's the one go-to technique that you would recommend for someone who is experiencing high anxiety or the emotional overload in the moment?
The one go-to technique.
Yeah.
I guess I would start not with a technique, but with a perspective,
Okay.
which I think is maybe more important than technique because what works for people technique-wise, person to person, can be pretty individual. I
Mhm.
think a helpful perspective that would be my one key recommendation is to reconceptualize dealing with stress as changing our relationship to the
Mhm.
stress or to the stressor as opposed to focusing on getting rid of it. There's a wonderful quote, and I do not know who to whom to cite it, but the quote is, "What you can't be with won't let you be," which I think is tremendously profound. And often when we say, I have to get rid of this thing, I have to get rid of the stress, I have to make it go away, or I have to make that person stop doing what they're doing, or this thing in the news stop being the way it is, we're setting ourselves up for disaster because we don't have control over that, right? We only have control over ourselves. And so I like to really encourage people to think about their own iteration of the perspective. How can I change my relationship to this thing as opposed to changing the thing itself? Because often we don't have influence or control over the thing itself. That's really the number one thing that I would encourage people to be curious about if that's the sort of problem they're facing.
Mhm. That's amazing. Yeah. And then also on this, this thing is coming. I mean, this is definitely a game changer. But do you think that there's a connection between chronic stress and the persistent stories that we carry in our minds? So, how do we interrupt that uh, loop before it turns into something more serious like
Mm,
uh, chronic pain or depression?
mm. Well, yes, certainly I think that's a connection. And I think given that we are meaning-making creatures who are always seeking to connect the dots, it's and we are creatures who love stories, right? We have this symbolic language at our disposal. We're able to think in abstractions. And so we're able to create stories of truly epic proportions about all kinds of things. And so I think being aware of our gravitational pull towards creating narratives and storylines is a really helpful starting point. Because
Mhm.
if we can sort of, the ACT folks call it defusing, which is such a great word. If we can defuse from, if we can step back from and separate ourselves from the story we've created and point to it and say, oh, that's a story I've created out of certain data points that I've connected and to make a certain shape, like good old connect the dot drawings for, in kids coloring books. And those dots can actually be connected to make any one of a number of things, not just the shape, the story that I've made out of it. As soon as we can point to that, we've created some breathing room between this idea of the data points we have, what is happening, and the story we've made up about what it all means. And
Mhm.
that breathing room in and of itself is so tremendously powerful, right? It is the difference. We could use a very common and sort of simple example, but that most people in the internet age have experienced. Your data point is you have a cough. You go online, you Google cough. Hey, what does it mean? And next thing you know, you have created a storyline about how you have some horrific disease, right? Because you read something and it said, "Oh, do you have this?" And you go, "Yeah, gosh, maybe I do have some of that too." And now you've created data points and you've connected them all in a series of ways that create this story out of almost nothing. And so,
Mhm.
simply by recognizing our tendency to create these big storyline narratives and stepping back and going, wait, how did I get from one data point, I have a cough, to this huge connect the dots narrative that's making me feel terrible? Just by recognizing that in and of itself, we get tremendous relief. And that's before anything else ever happened, before we even start working with our questions about those data points or our questions about why it is that we want to buy into a narrative like that.
Understood. Yeah, yeah. So definitely, that's really great. Thank you so much for sharing this. And um, I'll come to BT. Like, uh, you have developed a faith-based approach, while Lenses work focuses on the therapeutic techniques.
Mhm.
So some might see that those as a kind of opposing methods, but I see potential synergy here definitely. So how do you, I mean, this is for both of you. I'll start. So I mean, how do you both of you view the relationship between faith and therapy in the healing process?
I don't see a conflict because have they both have measurable results. I mean, that's why science and faith all the same tend to kind of point in the same direction. You
Mm,
can go to the doctor and you get healed of all and cured, or at least diminished a lot of that chronic pain. There are a lot of things that science can do, a lot of things that just a psychological approach of working with people can do, and a lot of things
mm,
and I don't want to call this faith, okay, because this isn't faith healing. Faith is where you simply believe it's going to happen and then it happens. This is spiritual. Um, and spiritual can do the same thing as the sciences do, but a lot of times it can do things that sciences don't. A lot of times we look at science and we see things that occur, cause and effect, and we create a model that is a scientific model of the logical steps of what goes on. Just like, for example, unforgiveness and thoughts, right? You look at a lot of studies, and studies will show that mental struggles with things like unforgiveness and bitterness. Bitterness, I would say, is a subset of unforgiveness, or maybe a root of unforgiveness. Is been understood to be a cause, a root of as much as 60 to maybe 70% of certain types of chronic pain. And yet in science, like take arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, science says that rheumatoid arthritis is an autoimmune system issue. And so they treat it that way. And because they're correct, they're able to minimize the pain and the swelling and the stiffness through rheumatoid arthritis. But yet I've found that arthritis frequently also has a spiritual root. And so like one lady, her name was Susan, her she'd been diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis for 15 or 20 years. And this day it was flaring up, and she asked if I could pray with her. And I asked her, do you have any unforgiveness for anyone? She said, yes. And I said, who was it? She said, it's my sister about 20 years ago, and I've never been able to forgive her. I said, would you be willing to forgive her to get rid of your arthritis? She said, yes. So I simply led her in prayer. All a prayer is simply engaging this higher power. I call him God, but it doesn't really matter what name we assign to him. And I just led her, Lord, I repent of unforgiveness towards whatever her sister's name is, and I forgive her. And then I said, God, would you please remove arthritis now? And I had her walk up and down a flight of stairs. She said, it feels a lot better. Okay, so keep in mind, our unforgiveness is part of our thoughts. It's a thought that we hold on to that we're upset about. And then she caught up with me about 5 weeks later, and she said, I want to give you the rest of the story, Beatty. She said, ever since you led me in prayer and you prayed with me, I've had no arthritis pain. Then she said, last week I went back to the doctor, and he retested me. He says, I have no arthritis in my body. And not only that, he said that my body shows no sign of ever having had arthritis. So this isn't a faith approach, it's a spiritual approach, because if there's actually a spiritual root that is a root cause of some of these issues, and you can get rid of that root, wouldn't it make sense that the issue disappears? And while science can approach it and minimize it, if you get rid of the root, then you get rid of the problem. That's what I've been finding. And I find a very comfortable connection between sciences and the spiritual approach. I think that in certain cases, the spiritual approach is more effective, but I don't discount the effectiveness of the sciences. And there's some things that, I'll be honest, sometimes we're just kind of messed up in our brains because of indoctrination that we've gone through, whether it's our own indoctrination or whatever. And that may not be a spiritual root, but it definitely is a mental thing. And the sciences can help me get through that. So I see a very coexistence between the two and not a separation.
Amazing. So Lindsay, what do you say?
I think that what we're ultimately pointing to in either case is the power of the mind and the mind-body connection. And I think many people have different ways of talking about the mind's what the mind is amenable to and what is accessible for some people and not others. And I think that's completely understandable. And ultimately, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is find ways of helping people in ways that are accessible to them as individuals. And so, however we want to understand the mind-body connection in a way that is most accessible to us and our history and our culture and our experience, I believe is a good and powerful tool.
Wow. That's amazing. Yeah. And so here one more thing is like uh it's interesting like how healing doesn't have to come from just one avenue. So let's say like in your experience, have you ever seen a client uh, kind of achieve the breakthroughs when they opened themselves up and to a spiritual practice, even if they were initially resistant?
Hmm. I suppose I'm hesitant on that question because I think these words that we're using, like spiritual or faith,
Mm.
or I think these words can be defined by different people differently. And so I'm cautious to make any broad brush statements about what yes or no's or does or doesn't, because I think these are words that are imbued with a lot of different meanings depending on who's using them in the context. I think I would be comfortable saying that there are certain people who have had really meaningful and meaningful in a way that was surprising to them experiences when they've been open to perhaps different perspectives than they have in the past. And some people might refer to that explicitly as spiritual, some people might not. Some people might refer to it explicitly as religious, some people might not. Some people might refer to that as simply a understanding or appreciating mind body connection in a way that they didn't before. So I think there's a host of ways in which people might describe what I think you're pointing to, which is being open to or becoming open to understanding these connections in a way that previously they had not been open to. And
Excellent.
I think anytime somebody is willing to be open to possibilities, as long as those possibilities aren't in some way harmful or dangerous, I think then that is always potentially another pathway or tool in the toolbox, and nobody can have too many of those.
Understood. I agree. I agree, but it's okay. Like I mean, it's totally fine. So okay, I'll quickly come to BT. So uh, like many people struggle with the idea of letting go of control, especially when they lived in chronic pain or trauma for so long. Uh, so how do you help someone who is kind of skeptical of surrendering to prayer or maybe process, spiritual process to find the freedom?
Yeah. Uh, it's really kind of easy, I think.
Mhm.
There's a saying that there's no atheist on a plane that's about to crash. Bad timing, I know, in the United States because we had several things happen recently on that. But if you think about this, people who are resistant to prayer, when things in their life get severe enough, they usually blame God, even if they don't believe him, because there's got to be someone up there who created all this, and if there is, you could have stopped it. That kind of approach. But usually, before we get there, we'll eventually say, "Please help me." And what I find is a lot of times, if someone has been struggling with chronic pain for years and they want to get free, most of them are willing to try most anything as long as it's not too expensive or too destructive or has too many risks. And there's no risk in prayer because if this is fake, right, then all you've done is you said some words and nothing happens. But if it's real, you say some words and we'll call it the miraculous happens at times.
Mhm.
Sometimes it doesn't seem miraculous, but like just the other day, this was 3 weeks ago, I
Okay.
teach an addiction recovery center, and these women go through a lot of struggles. And one lady had a car accident, went through the windshield, and broke her AC, which is a bone in the shoulder, and her shoulder blade. She didn't have money for insurance, so she literally just put it in a sling, and it sat over 3 years in a really bad, it was just chronic pain. So by the time she got to a doctor, orthopedic surgeon, he said, this is going to be a terrible surgery because I'm going to have to drill through, I'm going to have to break things apart, rewire them, and it's going to be incredibly invasive. And you're going to be in a lot of pain. It's going to take a minimum of 12 weeks to heal, and then a lot of therapy to actually get that arm moving again. So 4 weeks after the surgery, she was sitting in my class, and I simply led her through this simple approach, just saying, Lord, if there's anything that I've done that I need to repent of, and she just did that. And in fact, all these stories are on video, or at least this one for sure, that I can direct you to. But she said, once she went through that prayer, then within 10 minutes, she was moving her arm all the way around in full motion with her other arm that had never been damaged. She went back to the doctor 2 weeks later for her 6-week checkup. He's been in orthopedic surgery for 20 years. He was flabbergasted. He said, no one recovers that quickly, and especially with what I had to do to your shoulder. But she said it has the same range of motion and no pain that she had before the accident. And I've seen things like this, all kinds of chronic pain. Another lady, her elbow had been fused because of a fight with a boyfriend 30 years ago. Her wrist was fused, and now it's all opened back up, literally within, for her, probably within 30 minutes. So there's some things that we don't understand, science can't grasp, and that's why I share sometimes, this approach, science can do a lot, but this approach can do what science has never been able to do. And those type of work that I'm seeing, just leading people in, it's what I call a prayer of freedom, which I wrote a book about it with a process, is doing things that my dad and my granddad and great-granddads and my brother-in-law is a doctor, doing things that they count that it's impossible. Glaucoma being totally disappeared, worn out hips being restored where you don't have to have hip replacement surgery. That's not the routine. That's not the norm. So I don't want to set that as a standard. But the things that I'm seeing simply when we approach the God of the universe in the proper way, I've seen it become really just life-changing.
Wow, that's amazing. And great. Thank you so much for sharing this. And also, so before we wrap, I mean, this is for both of you. I'd love to hear from both of you. Like, if someone who is listening right now who feels trapped, whether it's a kind of chronic pain, anxiety, or depression, so what's one thing they can do today to start their journey towards freedom?
All right. Without being self-promoting, but when I wrote the book, The Prayer of Freedom, I wrote it for that specific reason. How do you free people from this? And as I've tested this, where people have just gone through it on their own, there's a worksheet in the back and the prayer process up front. And it has a nearly 90% success rate in people getting complete freedom from most of their issues. So the one thing that they would do, I would say, just go get the book. And if you get on any of the main online bookstore websites, it's a 30-day money-back guarantee. You can always send it back if it doesn't work, so it won't cost you anything. But if it does work, it could be the solution. So I would just encourage, go to if you just take the title, The Prayer of Freedom, and then add a book, theprayerfreedombook.com. I've got, I actually have a short prayer there that's one of the most powerful ones. You can just download for free. And for some people's chronic pain, it'll actually take care of it because it's a prayer of unforgiveness. And that is a root for many chronic pains. But you can also learn more about the book, and you can get access to any place you want to buy it online.
Okay. And Lindsay, like, what do you say?
Yeah, I would say something a little more general, which is I think the thing that stops people up is they get fused to the storyline or caught up in the narrative that this is the way it is. and that this is the way it's going to be. And that inhibits them from being curious about what else is out there, and whether what else is out there for you is a some sort of spiritual practice, or a different kind of therapy, or a different kind of engagement with the problem, capital T, capital P. I think the biggest block is people giving up on trying, right? Because they double down on the storyline of this is the way it is. And so if you can recognize when you become fused to that kind of certainty that you know the outcome and you know how this story ends, et cetera, if you can recognize that, you can unhook from it. And once you've unhooked from it, you've opened up a world of possibilities for yourself. I think one of the most illustrative examples to me is when people are rehabbing from injuries and they're really frustrated with physical therapy, right? And they say it's not doing anything for me. This isn't, I'm doing these silly exercises with towels around my toes, and I'm flexing, and I don't think this is making me any stronger, or this isn't helping me with my balance issue, or this isn't helping me with my pain. Well, that's one physical therapist. And there are a lot of kinds of physical therapy in the world, and there are a lot of physical therapists in the world. And so being a little relentless about saying, okay, this thing wasn't the thing, but that doesn't mean there isn't a thing out there that can help me. And again, that thing, or that combination of things, I think that's the other thing, is often people get hyper focused on wanting one thing. This is the thing that's going to be the thing, as opposed to being open to the idea that the thing for you that's going to help you with what you're seeking relief from is going to be a combination of things for you. And that could be any combination of things for you. But being relentlessly open and relentlessly curious and relentlessly willing to try new things, even when you feel down, even when you feel dejected or a little demoralized by a lack of progress on something. I think that's really the key. And we can hold at the same time, yes, it is normal and understandable to feel a little stuck or a little hopeless if you've been struggling with something chronically. And at the same time, you can also continue to seek out new pathways. You can do both of those things at the same time. You don't have to feel optimistic in order to try new things. And I think the more open people are to that, and the more they're aware of how destructive that's it, there's no more help for me because I've tried this and this storyline is, the more freedom we have to discover new things that might be helpful, whatever that thing is, whether it's spiritual or secular or any combination thereof.
That's great. Lovely. Great. So this has been such an inspiring conversation, dear listeners, with Lindsay and Vicky. And what we have learned today is that healing isn't a kind of one size fits all process. It's all about rewriting the stories that don't serve us, um, embracing spiritual roots when needed, and trusting that change is possible. So, dear listeners, if today's episode has sparked something in you, do not just let it sit with you. Share it with someone who actually needs to hear this, and take action, whether that's journaling your story, or trying Lindsay's 3 minute stress hack, or exploring Betty's 3 step prayer process. So you can learn more about our guest by checking out Lindsay at Onward Psychological Services and Betty's book, The Prayer for Freedom. I'll put the links into the show notes for your easy reference. And as always, thank you so much for riding the waves of change with us today on Healthy Waves. And stay strong, stay curious, and keep riding the forward. So, with this, thank you so much.
Thank you both.